Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.
WisconsinEye on the campus of Chippewa Valley Technical College, interviewing Jodi Emerson of Eau Claire, a Democrat running in the 91st Assembly District. Jodi, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you so much for having me.
On your campaign Facebook page, you say you want to be a voice for the voiceless. Explain that.
Well, for the last 5 years, I've worked in an organization fighting human trafficking, and I really became invested in that because nobody was being the voice for that. And then the more I got involved in that, the more I started seeing other things that were happening in our community. I realized that there's a lot of voiceless people in our society who don't have the wherewithal, don't have the finances, don't have the connections to have a voice in our government. And so whether it's human trafficking victims, homeless people, people who are working 2 or 3 jobs and don't have time to write to their assembly person or their state senator or their congressman because they're just worrying about making ends meet, those are the people that I want to be the voice for.
You also make a priority of healthcare in rural areas. You have older residents, and you have young leaving, and you have household income that is lower than the statewide average. You have more and more health care being provided by Medicare or Medicaid. What are your thoughts on how to keep our healthcare systems in place or improve them in rural areas?
Well, the first thing that we can do as a state is to accept those Medicaid dollars. Anytime we can do that and boost up our systems, I think is phenomenal. I think it was a very big mistake for Governor Walker to refuse those funds. So simply accepting the Medicaid dollars, like you said, there's a lot of clinics and nursing homes who rely completely on Medicaid dollars to keep their doors open. And we need to continue that. We also need to make sure that we're reimbursing for Medicare and also other insurances too. It's not just about having insurance, it's about having affordable insurance. It's about how many people do we know that have a $10,000 deductible, and starting to look at healthcare as a human right. When are we going to do that? Because in Eau Claire here, we've got incredible medical care. But if people can't afford it, they're kind of like the kid staring in the candy store window thinking, I really want to be part of that, but I can't afford it. And so if you've got a $10,000 deductible and you've got some chest pain, you're going to look at your bank account to figure out whether you can afford to start paying that deductible before you get in for care. And that's just not right. When there's a crime happening on my block, I don't have to look at my checkbook and say, do I have money to pay the deductible before I call the police? No, it's my human right to be able to have protection. And I think we need to start looking at healthcare as a human right.
Is the ultimate answer a universal health plan for the nation?
I don't know what the ultimate answer is. I do favor looking at more government provided, where we can buy into a larger policy, whether that's a single payer or universal health care. I don't have all the answers on that, but anytime we can get a larger pool, I think is really important. So having a Affordable Health Care Act marketplace in Wisconsin would be really good. But also, excuse me, I lost my train of thought.
Let me move on to another healthcare
Thank
question.
you.
Does state government have a role in retaining and recruiting physicians, nurses, and other medical professionals?
Absolutely. And I think that there's things that can happen on a statewide policy level as well for that. I know that there has been some issues with University of Madison where they're cutting potentially some programs involved in the pro-choice, pro-life debate that would actually affect whether people could be certified OBGYNs that graduate from Madison. And so that's a problem. We need to make sure that we've got the medical staff here, whether it's for women's health care, whether it's for mental health care. There's a huge disparity in being able to access mental health care in a lot of our areas as well, and that's really important.
I'm sure when you talk to 91st District voters, they talk about highways, There's a gridlock in the Capitol on how to pay for our highway, our future highways, our maintenance, our bridges. How would you pay for a highway system?
I think we have to start looking out of the box. We can't just be looking at gas tax anymore because, I drive a Prius. So compared to maybe a pickup truck, I'm paying less for the wear and tear that's happening on the roads because my Prius is getting 50 miles to the gallon. So I'm not investing as much in gas tax. So we need to maybe look at some vehicle taxes as well. Or, as we get more electric vehicles, they're not paying anything for gas tax. So if we're only relying on gas tax to fund our roads, or as that being a main part of it, that's a problem. But I would say a lot of our tax issues come down to priorities. People will say, well, we don't have the money to fix our roads. We have the money to help Foxconn come into the state of Wisconsin.
So you would not have voted for the Foxconn?
I would absolutely not have voted for it.
Well, why?
I don't think that it's going to benefit the whole state, for one, and there was not a whole lot of incentives to make Foxconn really hit certain parameters. If we're investing that much in a single company, I think you need to say, we expect you to pay this much for wages. We expect you to have, this many Wisconsin residents that you're employing there. Some benchmarks that are assured in order to get the money. And there is some of them, but not as much as I would have liked to have seen.
There's a buzz in the Capitol. Let's go back to transportation funding. A buzz in the Capitol, a discussion of tolling. Your position?
Intriguing. That just seems like such an Illinois thing to me. So it's kind of, it's like saying go Bears. We just don't want to go there. I really haven't thought about that as much. The 91st is pretty much the city of Eau Claire. So we don't have as many of the state highways that are affected that, maybe like the 92nd and the 93rd would. There's a lot of state highways. So it is intriguing to me when I get out of the district to see how broken down some of our highways are. I don't know the finances of a toll booth because we have to build them, and so there's infrastructure that goes in there. I don't know how long they would take to pay off. So it's an interesting thought, and I would be intrigued to learn more about it. I think more would go into investing into building the tolls, manning the tolls, than we would actually get out of them for maintaining the roads.
With school shootings, mass shootings, do we need to change gun laws?
I think we need to change gun laws. I think we need to reinstate the 48-hour waiting period, not only for other people's safety, but for somebody's personal safety. I had a friend of mine who ended up committing suicide a few years ago after he bought a gun and shot himself, and he'd had mental health issues for many years. People tried to keep him as safe as possible, got him a new apartment where he didn't have a garage, where he couldn't park his car in and leave it running anymore, because that was an issue for him a couple of times. People tried to keep him as safe as possible, but he went to a store, got a gun, came home, and shot himself. If he would have had that 48-hour waiting period, he would probably still be with us today. So it's not just about protecting other people with the 48-hour waiting period, it's about protecting people themselves. And I don't think waiting 48 hours, in my personal view, is it doesn't infringe on anybody's right. It's not going to affect the gun hunters because, they're planning their trip way before 48 hours. So if they need a new gun, I know my dad is a longtime hunter. He, would start sighting his rifle in September for the November deer hunting season. So he was more than prepped for it. So I don't think the 48-hour waiting period would affect hunters at all. So I think it's something that we really need to look at, and I think it's a sensible solution that can protect people. If somebody can't wait 48 hours for a gun, that just seems ridiculous to me.
Local governments have been living with levy limits since 2006. Some local officials say they're really hurting their ability to provide local services. Mm-hmm. Is it time to loosen or repeal levy limits?
I believe it is. I believe that...
Which one, loosen or repeal?
I think any good policy can at least start moving that direction. And so if we hit a middle ground by loosening them to start with, it's a start at least. I think a community elects local officials. And so let's give them the power that we've entrusted to them to put our taxes where they're at. And if we don't like what we've done, that they've done, then we boot them out 2 years later, whether it's a school board, a city council, county board. They're not signed up for a 10-year limit. If we don't like what they've done, we can change it over the next election cycle. So there are ways of fighting that. I understand why it happened, but I think it's gotten ridiculous, and I think we've really taken local control out of local government. In Eau Claire here recently, there was a living wage ordinance that was passed by the city, by the county, and that was taken away by the state. So we as a community, we as a county said, we want to invest in workers. We want to make sure that we're paying them a living wage. The state came in and said, no, you don't get to make that choice. I don't think that's right. I think if a community is saying this is what we want to do, then why shouldn't we be able to do it?
What should the state minimum wage be?
Oh, boy. That's an interesting topic because I think as there's not a clear-cut answer to that one because we do have a lot of high school kids who are working. And, do they really need to be making $15, $17 an hour for working at McDonald's? Or does paying part-time workers, does that hurt, a small business? So there is that to add into it as well. But being in Eau Claire, we've got one of the largest, if not the largest, income disparities between the haves and have-nots here. So there is money in this community to pay workers. There's just not sometimes the will to do it. And I'm not saying every time, because I know there's a lot of struggling small businesses. But I think we can get people up to a more livable wage. And sometimes that's where it's important that government is leading the way by getting to a more livable wage. Because then maybe the businesses are going to have to raise their wages in order to attract workers. We talk about all the time about how we don't have, there's positions open, but nobody's applying for them. Well, when Uniroyal was in town 25 years ago, I don't remember them ever saying, gosh, we're really hurting for workers, because they paid their workers really well. It was a hard, tough job, but people were compensated for it. So sometimes businesses need to step up and pay the people in order to get the workers that are there. Now, that's not always a possibility, because there are struggling businesses as well. And so it's hard to say, blanket statement, we need to have a $15 minimum wage. However, I do think we need to incrementally get raising it to that level as well.
Going back to your priority of public schools, if we need to dramatically increase the amount of state aid for K-12 public schools, where would you find the additional money?
I think that taking some of the money away from the vouchers is something that's really important. Okay. I think we need some transparency in how much money is actually going towards voucher schools. I think there's a lot more going towards voucher schools than people understand. And I think that's important. I think as a taxpayer, I want to know where my money's going without having to spend 4 days researching it. It should be a lot more accessible. Whether it's on a tax bill that comes at the end of the year or whatever. It needs to be simple and easy to read. So that's part of it. But we do want to build a growing economy in Wisconsin. And so we need to do that by funding education. We can find the money for Foxconn, we can find the money for prisons, but somehow we can't find the money for education. That if we are investing in more education, we maybe wouldn't have to invest as much in prisons, because we'd have people more engaged at a younger age and perhaps wouldn't be going down the criminal path.
Which is my next question. A big item in the next state budget will be the debate over prisons. The prison in Waupun and Green Bay, they're both built in the 1800s. Mm-hmm. We're closing the 2 juvenile prisons. Mm-hmm. Do we need a new state prison?
I think we need to re-look at what we're doing with criminal justice altogether. There's a lot more money that can be invested in treatment instead of prison. Diversion programs, mental health. There's a lot of people who are in prison who actually have mental health or addiction issues. I'm not saying that don't put people in the system, but is the system necessarily a punitive system, or is it a rehabilitation system? As part of my work with the anti-human trafficking organization, I went and visited Stanley Prison. I talked to prisoners there. We worked in the juvenile detention center in Eau Claire. And to see the difference between those two places Juvenile detention was a lot more about rehabilitation, about giving things for people to do so they could kind of work through what got them into that situation. So hopefully they wouldn't get there again. And at Stanley Correction, it was a lot of, I felt like the people were just kind of aimless. And so there needs to be more programming, more getting people ready to be put back into the world, not just in a 10-year timeout or a 30-year timeout where they're not doing anything other than figuring out how to get their mind active and using contraband to make, tattoo guns and things like that. I mean, it was amazing to see some of the contraband that they had collected because these people needed their minds going. Let's use, let's give them something to do. Let's keep their minds active in a positive way, not a negative way.
What's your position on recreational marijuana and medical marijuana?
I'm intrigued by looking at that as far as legalizing it, but I don't think it's just a simple, yes, we need to do this, get the tax base, get people out of the prisons. There's a lot more complicated issues involved with that. I was just reading an article today from the New York Times about how dispensaries in Colorado are having a hard time with what do they do with their money from that, because they can't put it in banks because the federal government still considers
Schedule 1.
Exactly, and so they can't invest it in banks, and so they have all this cash just laying around. And so it's not as simple as just saying, here in Wisconsin, this is what we're choosing to do. I'm intrigued by that issue. I think some of these states are being really smart about legalizing it to get the tax base, to get, decriminalizing it so that they can, not be putting people in jail and not increasing the prison populations. But we have to look at it bigger picture. We have to get the federal government involved in it as well.
Last question, three-way primary, August 14th.
Four-way primary.
Four-way, thank you for the correction. Four-way primary, August 14th. Do you want to highlight the differences between you and your opponents on August 14th?
I think the big difference between me and my opponents is because of my work with the anti-trafficking organization. In the last 5 years, I've gotten 7 bills through the state legislature. I've worked with Republicans and Democrats. I can hit the ground running on day one. I've been down there, I've written bills, I've lobbied for bills, I've built relationships with other legislators. So I'm the only one who has in the last couple of sessions gotten any legislation through on the state level. That's a big difference. We're all going to talk about how we want to fund education and protect the environment, all the big Dem heavy hitters. But the difference is I have the experience to actually do it. And so I think that is the big difference between us is I've got the connections, I've done it before, I know how this system works, and I can start working for the people of Eau Claire right away on day one.
Thank you. Jodi Emerson of Eau Claire is a Democrat running in the 91st Assembly District. The four-way primary is August 14th. Thank you, Jodi.
Thank you for the time.
Thanks.